back in. So if we could pick up, I believe that the stream stopped when you were doing the basketball um, uh, demonstration.
Okay.
So if we could pick the discussion back up right after that video, I think people will be able to see it.
Okay, one second. Okay, well, we're going back live now. One second. All right, so we're live here, and I just got to
So
share
Glenn,
this.
we want to stream. We want to put up your screen share once again. Pick the discussion back up right after the video.
Okay. So do we had the it had the clip of the basketball?
Yes, I believe that. Hello, everyone. If you're joining us back again, we had a problem with the stream, so we're going to pick back up where things went wrong. And so, yes, Raymond, it was right as you showed the basketball clip.
Okay.
So if you want to pick up perhaps right after that clip.
Okay. So again, I apologize for the interruption. So again, we see what we want to see, we hear what we want to hear. So if we take a look at this image here and just flip it on its side, you'll see that the face becomes the word liar. And again, oftentimes we lie to ourselves about what is going on and what we see, what we hear, how we experience the world. So how do you test for this? We've been talking about implicit bias. So Harvard in 1998 came out with implicit association test, which is a computer test. It measures bias that may not be consciously recognized. The website here it's a really fun kind of activity to do. If you go there, you just have to enter an email address. You don't necessarily have to put your real email address if you're worried about any confidentiality stuff, but that's the only information they ask from you is an email address. And you can take different tests and see what your unconscious bias is. So again, it measures bias. It's not consciously recognized by measuring the time that it takes for subjects to match representatives of social groups to particular attributes. So social groups might be things such as age, gender, race. I did things on psychiatry and mental health. Attributes would be things like good, bad, cooperative, stubborn, etc. It operationalizes unconscious bias by the hypothesis that subjects can match up a group more quickly if they connect factors in their mind, regardless of their awareness of this connection. And again, we could say irregardless based on the new addition to the dictionary. So in plain terms, here's how it works. This is an example of a screenshot from an IAT. So you'll have two sides of the screen, the left side and the right side. The left side, in this case, has black patient or bad, and then the right side would be white patient or good. And then a stimulus comes on the middle of the screen, and your job is to either put it to the left-hand side or the right-hand side by pushing one button or another. So you would get a stimulus like this. And in this case, and in this example, you would have to put this in the left-hand side. A word may come on, such as pleasure. Pleasure would be considered a good word, and so you would put that in the right-hand side. And they measure the time it takes for you to react to this. And there's a bunch of sequences of stimuli, and you go through this test. And you go through a couple different times, and then they switch it. So, and now white patient is paired with bad on the left-hand side, and black patient is paired with good on the right-hand side. And again, same stimuli. So in this case, you would have to put this face on the right-hand side, or this word you would put on the right-hand side. And again, it measures the time that it takes you to categorize this. And what they found is it's very, very small difference. We're talking about milliseconds of difference, but it is statistically significant in that when you think groups make sense, so in this case, it would be white, good, black, bad in terms of the grouping, you're quicker to respond. When things don't make sense in your mind or with your view, you take a little bit more time to answer the question. And here's what they found. So it's pervasive. Everybody has it. So this is not singling out any one particular group. This is pervasive across all cultures, across all societies. They have done this globally, and they found some commonalities. Again, not with everyone, but these are greater than 70%. So they seem to map to existing social hierarchies and stereotypes, where men are considered greater than women, whites are considered greater than blacks, males equal science, females equal liberal arts. I'm not commenting on if this is correct or not in terms of values of society. This is just how people see the world. And again, there can be some differences based on different societies. So if you go to India, for example, there's differences within the caste system that we don't have here. So it's not that it's all innate. It's not in our DNA that this happens. These are learned type things. What is innate is the system that measures this and causes us to do this. But the input is learned through time. And oftentimes it's completely incompatible with our conscious values. So I'll take myself, for example. If you were to ask me, are you sexist? Are you racist? I would say absolutely not. But if I take these tests, it may come out that my bias is towards what we're seeing here, where men are greater than women, whites greater than blacks, males are equal to science, females equal to liberal arts. The reason that I'm interested in this is, as a physician, especially the males being equal to science and females being equal to liberal arts, has a profound impact on females within the medical profession. And we're going to take a look at that in a little bit. Here's another optical illusion. You can see a man smoking a pipe or a woman's face, depending on, or some people say it's a saxophone, person playing a saxophone, depending on how you are looking at it. So again, you see what you want to see and you hear what you want to hear. So what are the different types of unconscious bias? So there's a bunch of different types, hundreds, or at least over 100, 150, but we'll list the most common ones here so that we can talk about them. So there's an affinity bias, and that's being more receptive to people who resemble us in some way. So for example, I like him because he reminded me of myself at that age. So we find a common theme that makes us think of ourselves, and we tend to like that type of thing. So that's, again, going back to the groups as cave people. We stick together with people who are like us. Confirmation bias. So this is looking for information that supports our beliefs and ignoring details to the contrary. So these are things like, we've all heard birds of a feather flock together, and we've all heard opposites attract, but they both can't be true. They're contradicting statements that we hold true depending on the situation. If you see people that look like they belong together, we say, oh, birds of a feather flock together. If people don't look like they belong together, we say, oh, opposites attract. So we pick and choose the information that supports whatever we want to support at that time. And that's why scientific studies need to be double-blind, placebo-controlled, because again, we see what we want to see and we hear what we want to hear. Something called a halo effect. This is where if you like something about someone, then everything about them must be great. So they're so well behaved, so they must also be smart. Well, that doesn't necessarily have to be, but that may be something that we think about. The opposite of this is called the horns effect, and where if you don't like something about somebody, you think everything about them is bad. And as you're listening to these things, I want you to be thinking about when you're scrolling through things like social media or talking to your friends about certain topics, how this might be affecting your viewpoint. And it's not to say that it's right or wrong. It's just take into account how this may be affecting your viewpoints. There's perception bias, and this is stereotyping people based on a group that they belong to. So, for example, many crimes are committed by this particular ethnic group, so a person of that same ethnicity must be a criminal. And this could be incorrect on a lot of different levels, because if the initial assumption is based on another bias, such as a confirmation bias, then that's not necessarily true, and you're making another assumption based on something that's not true. So you do have to be careful with things like this as well. Something called the bandwagon bias or conformity bias. That happens when your views are swayed by the views of those around you. We all want to be liked. We all want to be accepted by the people that we surround ourselves by. So of course, we're going to try to have the same viewpoints as them so that we're not the outsider. So that would be something like, well, nobody enjoyed this presentation, so neither did I, even if you kind of did. An attribution bias. So this refers to how you perceive your actions and the actions of others. And this is very common, and it happens therapeutically. I use this one a lot, pointed out to people and how they see themselves and how they view others. So this stems from our inability to assess the reasons that lead to success and failure. So most commonly, we view our own success as internally driven and our own failures as externally driven. So if I did something great, I succeeded in something, well, that's because I have the ability to do it. I'm a great person. But if I fail, well, it was somebody else's fault, or the cards weren't in my favor. There was some other reason externally that caused me to fail. But the contrary causes us to view others by the different set of rules. So if someone else does something good, well, they probably were helped out by their external environment. And that, so we don't necessarily judge ourselves and others by the same standards. This is a very interesting one, the beauty bias. And this refers to how we unconsciously notice people's appearances and associate it with personality traits. And it can be good or bad. One of the famous studies was they found that if you are a good-looking person or physically attractive, you actually can get away with murder, literally. So they looked at how the legal system and jurors judge people who are good-looking, and they're actually less harsh in terms of judging them if you're a good-looking person. The only time that goes against that rule is if you use your beauty or your attractiveness to commit your crime. So if you try to swindle somebody, you're a con artist, you're actually judged more harshly for being a good-looking person. So I love this optical illusion. So if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So if you look at this, it appears as if those shades of fuchsia or however you want to call them versus the green, this diagonal line here looks lighter than the shading in here. And actually, if you take those green dots away, you'll see they're actually the same exact shade. Now, why that happens is just because of the proximity. You can see that these green dots are right on top of the fuchsia ones here, and that makes us perceive it as darker, even though it's the same exact shade. So we're all perceiving this the same way. It's the same stimulus, but we're interpreting it falsely. So who said it and when? There's nothing more painful to me at this stage in my life than to walk down the street and hear footsteps and start thinking about robbery, then look around and see somebody white and feel relieved. This was the Reverend Jesse Jackson in 1993 in the Chicago Sun-Times. This is a touchy kind of quote, the reason being that this can also be used for confirmation bias and skewed in a different way. But really, the reason that I think it's very important to put this quote in this lecture is because this shows way ahead of his time that Jesse Jackson was talking about this unconscious bias. And he's being forthcoming about his own interpretation of events that have been going around him. Here's another optical illusion. Which line is longer? This is a famous one. The middle line is the same on both objects. It's just the outside lines that make us think that the one on the right is longer. So height and leadership. So the percentage of US males that are greater than 6 feet tall is 15%. But if you take a look at Fortune 500 CEOs, 58% are greater than 6 feet tall. So that kind of shows how we associate height and leadership in this country. An increase in height by 10 centimeters, or about 4 inches, is associated with a 2.2 percentage point increase in the probability of holding a managerial position. So you move up the ranks faster and higher if you're taller. And at least half of the height leadership correlations due to a bias of positive correlation between height and cognitive and non-cognitive ability. So when you ask people about a person that they may have just seen a picture of, you may know nothing about them, you rate them as more knowledgeable and more physically apt to handle a situation based on height. Now, the physically apt could make sense, but we also think they're cognitively more intelligent by being taller. When you correct for age and gender, an inch of height is worth about $789 per year in salary. And these are old. This is from 2004. So it's maybe a little bit different now in terms of the numbers, but the impact is still the same. And again, this is how unconscious bias works in our world for or against people. So is this possible? So this is an impossible figure. But it looks, if you look at this end here, it looks like you should have 3 tubes coming off this base here, but when you trace it back to the base, it's not there. So it's an impossible figure. Again, an optical illusion. So getting back to my reasons for wanting to study this subject is, again, it's for females in the medical profession. So if you look at a 10-year comparison of women in medical schools, 1999 versus 2009, if you look, the applicants, it's about 50-50. That makes sense. It's representative of the population. Accepted applicants, still about 50-50. Residents, you're still up there and got a little bit better in 2010. But again, it's about half. And so that's pretty good of the average population. Instructors, which are the initial rank, they're about 50-50. Then you start moving up the ranks and females are going down. By the time you get to dean, you're looking in 2010 at only 13% of deans were females. So where are these women going? If you look at the numbers here, you can see it's disproportional as you move up the ranks. Actually, just in general, there's more males than females. So maybe it is just the percentage of males versus females. But if you look at this graph, it's actually not necessarily the case. And in this graph, the darker red is the female. You can see here that there's a higher percentage of the females are in the assistant professor, but they start to drop off as you go up, as opposed to the males, which kind of go up a little bit. It's steady around here, but they're moving up as they move up the ranks. So are you doubting your perceptions yet? So this is a completely equilateral square. And it just looks like it's bent here because of the circles. So again, going back to these females in medicine, so do aspirations equal opportunities? So maybe they don't want to go up the ranks. Maybe that's the case. Well, that's really not. They looked at 198 medical school faculty and they asked them about goals, attitude, experiences, and there was no gender differences in any kind of aspirations or self-assessments or willingness to take on the task. But the women were significantly less likely to be asked to serve on committee chairs, section heads, department heads. They weren't involved in decisions, and they didn't feel as if they had an influence in the department. So this is another interesting optical illusion. So if you look here, if you flip it, it looks like it says lift, but really it says nothing because these figures are not closed. So there really are no letters here at all. Our brain fills in the blanks. And again, that's what our brain does. It fills in the blanks and sees what we want to see and hear what we want to hear. This one, I'll tell you about a personal experience I had with this. 300 letters for faculty hired by major US medical schools were looked at. The letters for female candidates were significantly shorter and they were less record focused. They showed less professional respect. They referred to them as their first name versus doctor for men. They contained doubt raisers, 24% versus 12% for females versus males. They mentioned how they relate to others, 16% versus 4% for males. They referred to their personal life, 6% versus 1% for the males. And then you look at the male candidates, and they refer to their research more, they refer to their publications more, and they contain more standout adjectives. Now, why is this important? Because once you get to this level of the game, a lot of people look the same on paper. So these are the things that make you take another look at a candidate, the letters of recommendation. That's why they're very important. And I looked back after reviewing this data. I looked back at the letters of recommendation that I had written for people throughout the years. And I've never written a letter of recommendation for someone that I did not believe in. And this held true. It really did. And, again, this was unconscious. I didn't do this on purpose. But what it made me realize is I need to consciously make changes in how I write these letters of recommendation. And since that time, I have. And I go back and I reread all my letters to make sure that I'm being fair and equal to both candidates. So unconsciously, I was passing on to whoever was reading these letters of recommendation that a male candidate was more able to meet the requirements than a female candidate. And that, again, they were picking up on that subconsciously, and that's what that would explain why more males than females get hired. This is an absolute favorite of mine. When I do this in person, I actually hand out an overlay of this. These tables are exactly the same size. I know you don't believe me. You can measure them. What happens is the reason this optical illusion works is because if this were a three-dimensional image, this table here would be smaller and shorter than this table here because you'd be going out into the horizon. The problem is this is a two-dimensional image, and so our brain is using a set of rules that don't apply to this image and misinterpreting it. But I promise you, this line here is the same as this line here, and this line here is the same as this line here. So psychologists must be exempt from this, right? Because psychologists study this. Well, not really. And this is an interesting study that I found. Again, this has been in my repertoire here for over 8 years, and this study was done in 1999. So the name Karen, although timely, is not planned. So what they did was they looked at, they sent CVs, exactly the same CVs were sent out. The only difference was the name. It was either Brian Miller or Karen Miller. Other than that, exactly the same CV. And what they found was that Brian was more likely to be hired at entry and tenure level. And they also evaluated Brian as, they evaluated his research more positively and his teaching more positively, as well as his service. When they were the same CV. So again, people see what they want to see and hear what they want to hear. This is a good example. This in the middle here can be a 13 or a B, depending on whether you are reading ABC or 12, 13, 14. So what's in a name? Actually a lot. And what they did in this study was they sent out fictitious resume. They had 2 high quality resumes and 2 low quality resumes, but the resumes were the same for the high quality and the low quality. And then they had quote unquote African American versus white American sounding names, and they were randomly assigned. And 50% of the difference was attributed solely to the name, with a white sounding name giving you 8 years of experience on a resume. So again, all things being equal, same exact resume, just the name caused people to think differently about the information that they were being provided. So this again looks a little bit wavy, not so much here, but if you move away a little bit, it does. And again, it's just an optical illusion. This is an interesting study, the mommy tax. So parenthood looks very different on women and men. What they did here was they took 192 undergrads and they evaluated applicants equally qualified, same gender, and the only difference was mothers, not mothers. Mothers were 42% less likely to be hired. These fictitious candidates were evaluated on perceived warmth and competence. And what they found was mothers trade competence for warmth. Fathers gain warmth, but maintain competence. And it's competence that predicts interest and their interest in hiring you and advancing their workers. So what does that say? So for me, and I'm a father, it is actually in my advantage for whoever I'm applying for a job to know that I'm a father, because not only am I just as competent, but now I'm also a warm person. For a female or any, the mothers would be trading their competence for warmth. So yeah, we think you're a wonderful person and we like to hang out with you, but we don't think that you're qualified for the job. And these are pretty important, which is why, you know, with HR, they're not allowed to ask about things such as family and things like that. So what's wrong with this picture? This is the five-legged elephant, obviously can't happen. So physicians must be exempt then, right? Well, yes and no. What they found were that white, Asian, Hispanic physicians showed preferences for whites over blacks, but black physicians showed no significant preference. And this was, again, in 2004, 2006. Women showed less bias than men. And unconscious preferences for whites were 2 to 3 times higher than the physician's self-reported attitude. So again, if you ask them if they had a preference, they would say no, but that wasn't necessarily the case. So what does that mean? And again, this was part of my interest in studying this. The jury's still out, but if you look at some studies, they show that people, African Americans, do poorly with things like cardiac complications. And the reason the jury's still out is because it's more complicated than just how the physician is handling the patient. It has to do with other socioeconomic things, you know, where the patient's living, and that can also be linked to unconscious bias and the systemic bias. So, you know, those things are up for debate, but again, it's an important topic to be aware of and discuss. So here, both center dots are exactly the same size. So microaggression. So we have this data, and we show that people have you know, bias preferences in one way or another. So what does that mean? Because, you know, I'm not overtly biased, so I should be okay, right? Well, yes and no. You know, bias doesn't have to necessarily be completely overt. There's covert bias, which comes in microaggression, and these are more than just insults. These are verbal, behavioral, environmental indignities, intentional or not, that communicate some hostility, derogatory beliefs, some negative prejudicial slights. These are any kind of insults. You know, what happens is we're not necessarily aware of these kind of things, and these are just the little jokes that we do here and there, or sometimes it's even just body language of, you know, if you pass a certain group of people and you may hold a pocketbook tightly or put your hand on your wallet or things like that, they send a message to other people about what our unconscious bias is. And again, you may not have negative intentions, and oftentimes people don't have negative intentions, but it can set up people for failure in interpersonal relationships, and it's very important to be aware of these types of things. So we spoke about it. What can we do about it? So these are my opinions of what can be done. So education, educate yourself about the topic. And I think listening to this lecture, you know, looking at the resources that I put in my lecture, just going online, Googling it, just finding out more about it. That's key. That's always key. Don't take my word for it. Dive deeper into it. Expose yourself. Expose yourself to different groups different from yourself, not just one person or a small group of people, because that's going to lead to sample bias. You want to do it multiple times and Expose yourself as much as possible. And that goes with education as well. It's part of being humans. Evaluate any potential bias that you might have and don't get defensive. Again, we all have it, myself included. I'm not excluded from this group at all. You just have to realize that it's there, because if you realize that it's there, then you can do something about it. And if you're a well-intended person, just recognizing that it's there can help you to make positive changes. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person, not at all. This is not a judgment. It's just, it is what it is. It's there. So the only way to move forward is to talk about it and learn from it. And extrapolate. Extrapolate the consequences of your actions, of your words. Realize the potential consequences of words and actions, not just your intention. So yes, you may not have meant to do something, but it may have had unwanted consequences. So take time, pause, think about what you say or do before you do it, and try as much as you can to not participate in microaggressions, because it does matter. And it does, if you liken it to a paper cut, well, one paper cut is not so bad. You can deal with that. But if you get paper cuts every day all over your body, well, that's pretty painful and pretty oppressive. So that's the reason why it's important to recognize it and not participate. We don't know what other people are going through, what their struggles have been. And so you don't want to add to anyone's burden. We talk about this a lot in my house for my kids, but it holds true for everyone, again, myself included. Before you speak, before you act, think. So is it true, what I'm saying or doing? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? And is it kind? I think, if we're just kind to each other and everything we needed to learn in life, we learned in kindergarten. That's a basic human principle. If we can all act that way and just be kind to one another, I think we'll make a lot of headroad into all this. So that ends my lecture. And again, I'll open it up. If we have any questions, we have a few minutes. Did anyone send any questions, Mark?
No, we haven't seen any questions yet on Facebook or by email.
Okay.
Your presentation has been very holistic. I feel like we covered a lot of what people might ask about. If there's any final comments you wanted to throw out there, we'll give people a minute or two to submit a question if they have one.
Well, I just want to thank everyone for participating, watching, and I open myself up to any kinds of questions, comments, feedback. We need to have a dialogue. We need to open up dialogue in a safe space. And I'm here. My contact information was at the beginning of the lecture. You can reach me through the library, through my business, Lakes Region Wellness. And again, I'm here and would love to have conversations or be there as a resource for people.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I don't see any other questions yet. I think if anyone does have questions, you can ask by commenting to us on Facebook or reaching out to Dr. Raymond Suarez himself. And one thing that I thought of as you were just finishing your comments there about ways to overcome unconscious bias or to realize the times that you do have unconscious bias, reading is also a great way to combat that, because we have an enormous world of books here at the library, and there are many more out there as well. And it's a great way to sort of armchair travel, get into the mind of other people's experiences. So that's one thing to consider. I see that we've got a comment. How can I see this again? This recording is going to be available on our Facebook page after we finish with the live, and then we will also upload a copy of it to the Gilford Library YouTube page, so you'll be able to see it there as well. We've got a question. What is the test address online? Again, could you repeat that? Or
Sure. So it's just implicit.harvard.edu. If you just Google implicit bias or unconscious bias, you'll be brought to the pages eventually. It's just a Harvard link. So you can do implicit bias Harvard and it'll take you there. But it's just implicit.harvard.edu.
Very good. And I posted that in the chat as well. Awesome. This has been wonderful. Dr. Raymond Suarez, thank you for presenting with us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge about unconscious bias. I think it's super relevant, and it's something that all humans contend with. So I feel like I've learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to hearing the conversations here at the library.
Well, thank you. I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Oh, one last question before you go. We're asking, what are some microaggressions that we can check ourselves on? So what microaggressions should we look for in our own behaviors? You mentioned the sort of like clutching your bag as one, as if you're thinking that someone might mean you harm.
Right. So that's a physical one, but the ones that, and so those are definitely unconscious and difficult to get around. So education is the way to get around that. But for things that we have actual control over, things like our speech, check yourself. I think oftentimes, and again, I'm guilty myself, we may make, off color remarks to things, and those are microaggressions. And I find a good value system would be, I judge myself based on, would I want this published on the front page of a paper by quoting myself on it? And another good, I think, standard to look at is, if this trait that I'm going to make a comment on, if this were present in a superior of mine, a boss or some superior to me, would I still make that comment to that person? And if the answer is no, then you probably shouldn't be making that comment at all. And we're humans, we make mistakes, and people understand that you're not intentionally trying to harm people. I'm not saying you have to go around and question everything you do, but just be aware of it, and be aware of people's reactions to things that you say or do. And don't be afraid to apologize, because if you didn't mean harm, then no harm done. Just apologize and learn from your mistakes.
Thank you. Another question that came in is, have you done these experiments with direct care staff? I imagine they're asking about tests on unconscious bias with direct care staff.
So they have done, so again, if you go to the Harvard page, there's a bunch of different studies that they've done, and they run the gamut. And they have done studies usually with physicians and with residents, in terms of their views of different types of patients. The more recent studies have been with views on transgender and different sexual orientations and people's unconscious bias with that, and how they're treated within the medical system. So those studies do exist, and it tends to be the same type of reactions across the board, things that you would expect. So they're there, and you can look up specifics if you're interested.
Awesome. That was the last question we had. So thank you again,
All righty.
Dr. Suarez, and thank you to everyone tuning in.
All right. Take care, everyone.
All right. Goodbye.